Okay, this video is on Genesis 5. Think I am going to try to get through it quickly because it is not one of the more lively chapters in the Bible, though there are some important things in it, but it is mostly just telling listing descendants. So, a couple of quick things to mention here. When we finished with Genesis 4, Adam and Eve had just had another son, Seth, sort of replacing, that maybe is not the correct word, but Abel had died, and so they have another son, Seth. The Bible is going to trace its primary line, or its line of descendants, through the line of Seth. As when we get to the Noah story, of course, everyone dies except the family of Noah, and so we will see that it is really a new creation. And so Noah's line Noah is a descendant of Seth, which is what we will get to, how this chapter ends. And so the line of humanity is kind of traced through Seth. However, as we read the Bible, in particular, in the way we think about what the Bible talks about, so there is an idea, especially I suppose in Christian analysis or commentary over the last couple of thousand years, of something like the line of Cain and the line of Seth. And this is the dichotomy that we are set up with here. We are ending chapter 4 with the line of Cain, and now chapter 5 is going to be the line of Seth. And so you might think of this as rather than a sort of literal. Okay, so in chapters 1 to 11 of Genesis, as I have mentioned a few times probably, I am not reading these in a sort of videotape, historical, literal way at all. To me, these chapters are describing the structure of reality and then setting up the story of the full story of the Bible, in other words, the restoration of creation or the return to paradise, etc., however you want to phrase it. But these first 11 chapters, it seems quite clear to me that if you try to interpret everything in a very literal, as I said, videotape history kind of fashion, you will run into all kinds of difficulties and problems, and I really do not see any reason to do that. I think these chapters are communicating something, as I said, about the structure of reality, including the nature of mankind and the nature of God and so on. And that is the point. Whether, if you were thinking in literal terms, whether this happened, if Abraham was born, that Abraham is not in, but technically he is at the end of chapter 11. But anyway, I'm just making a point here. If Abraham was born in the year 2024 BC instead of 2071 BC, that doesn't change anything. It doesn't matter. And so and that is more into the more historical, anyway, portion of the Bible, the way that I would read it, more historically. But these first 11 chapters, I do not read that way at all. And the reason I bring this up here, in other words, for these 11 chapters, I'm looking for meaning, purpose, understanding of the world that is being set up, so that I can then understand the rest of the Bible properly. The reason I say that here is because of this line of Cain, line of Seth thing. As I think I just mentioned a minute ago, the line of Cain, if you read this literally, will essentially be wiped out, but that is not relevant to the meaning. You can sort of think of this, as I said, in Christian commentary and Jewish commentary, as something more like the line or the spirit of Cain and the spirit of Seth, and these sort of opposed or two different, anyway, forms of ways of being Seth being something like a second line in the spirit of Abel. You know, if you have these three, Abel is killed as we discussed, but in any case, you have the sort of the line of Seth and the line of Cain as a tool of analysis, a way of thinking of these two different paths of being, something like that. Okay, I think I will just start reading here and we will get through this. There are a few little things I want to say. I think one at the beginning, one at the end, maybe one in the middle, and then we will wrap up this video quickly. I may read the first part of chapter 6 because it does not, it's sort of leading into the Noah proper story, and just to add a little bit of extra content to this video, since the next video will have plenty in it once we begin the story of Noah. In fact, that may get, I don't know how much I will try to talk about that, because I do not know how much I can talk about it. I do not know how much I understand enough, so I will not be able to go into the Noah story the way I went into the previous ones. Whether the analysis was helpful or not, I do not know, but obviously I did talk about them for a while. Okay, so Genesis chapter 5. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. Okay, quick thing to say there, male and female he created them. He blessed them. That is something to remember. He blessed them. The blessing reminded me of back in Genesis chapter 1, after God created them. He blessed them, and God blessed them and told them to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, to rule over it, as we talked about, in a sort of kingly way, or something like that, priest or king, or so, to rule it properly, to subdue it and rule the earth properly. We've also talked a little bit about Eden being a temple, the initial temple of creation, and this idea of temple will come up again and again and again throughout our analysis here, because a temple is, because the Bible begins in the way I talked about it. I believe I said these things. I must have, because it is the way I think, although I forget to say some things. But I believe we talked about Eden as a temple. Go to the simplest terms, a temple being a dwelling place of God. In general terms, pagan gods and everything, it would be a dwelling place or something like that of a god. Or by dwelling, it doesn't mean something like a permanent home, but you can also think of it as a place of sort of special manifestation of the presence of the God, or in our case, I'm just going to start saying of God. So Eden, it is not like God would be confined to the temple, to a temple, but a temple for God is a place where God specially manifests his presence. And so that is on earth. So, right, God is in heaven and he creates earth, and then the temple is this place where heaven and earth meet, and God dwells there. Again, dwell not meaning confined there, but manifests his presence there. And so in that sense, which is what a temple is fundamentally, that Eden is obviously a temple. But I mean it in so yeah, in that sense, it obviously is a temple. And I've been reading a book recently that has impressed me quite a bit, has impressed this idea upon me quite a bit, and I think it's right. It is the way I think. It's just it's expounding on this temple notion, but this is absolutely how I've thought about the Bible for a long time. The entire point of the rest of the Bible is that God's presence, God wants to restore. In the initial creation in Eden, heaven and earth were united. in this place, Eden, which is where creation began. That's where all the people were, because it was Adam and Eve. And so God and man were united. God and his creation were united, were in proper fellowship. Man, through his decisions, broke that fellowship, and the entire point of the Bible is to completely restore that fellowship. In other words, to restore creation as a temple, right? God, because man corrupted creation, God's presence has, at this point in the Bible, has withdrawn from that corruption. Well, the entire point, or the entire story, the story that is being described throughout the Bible, is the restoration of that full communion, of that full communion between God and creation. And at the end of the Bible, in Revelation, that has fully been restored. God and creation are fully restored. Heaven and earth are reunited completely, as in the original. So, but notice what has happened there. So the entire earth has become the temple. And so this idea, in Genesis 1, this blessing of man and to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, that will come up over and over and over in various forms. And the idea, presumably, had things gone properly in Eden, is that man would have multiplied, had children and multiplied, and slowly, essentially what would have happened, had there been no split between God and creation, no corruption caused by man, what would have happened is essentially Eden would have grown and filled the whole earth. So the temple, and wherever God manifests his presence, that's the temple. So the temple would have expanded. You can think of it in the way temples expanded in history. A new king would come into being and would come into kingship. And if the society was thriving, they would expand the palace. They would expand the temple of their god, etc. It happened in Judaism. It happened in all societies. When thriving, the sort of, as the kingdom expands, the presence of God expands, something like that. And so anyway, what would have happened? So remember that blessing is that blessing in Genesis is God saying to fill the earth, and as God's image, when we properly expand the temple, and we are God's image, reflecting him into the new parts of the temple, parts of creation, as we work our way out into creation and fill the earth to subdue it, we are spreading God by being his image. So we are spreading the presence of God, enlarging the temple, and that is that is going to be the entire point of the Bible. That is what happened. If you think further in Christian terms, at the end of Matthew, Jesus tells the disciples to essentially spread Christianity to all the earth. And in other words, spread God, to reflect God, we'll get to that when we get to Christianity, but God is going to dwell within you, and you go out into the world and spread the word, spread the gospel of Jesus, the gospel of God. And so it's the same thing. And of course, Abraham is going to be told that his descendants he will be the father of many nations, and so on, as you may have heard. But the point is the entire story of the Bible is this plan of God's presence expanding outward to fill the earth. Okay, so that when we were reading this here in chapter 5, verse 2, and it said, male and female, he created them, and he blessed them. I wanted to bring that up. When I read the word blessed, it reminded me of Genesis, because I think it's referencing that, or it is referencing that. That's exactly what it's talking about back in Genesis 1. And so I wanted to point out what that blessing means. It's this idea, and the whole purpose of the Bible is to achieve that blessing and to achieve that filling of the earth with the presence of God. And so that's what the whole story is going to be about. So anyway, wanted to point that out because that's where we're headed. And it's going to start, we're going to see attempts, and it has some success, then it pulls back, and success, and then it pulls back, and so on. Okay, so and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. When Adam and Eve had lived, or when Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. That brings up another point. A lot of, when we are going through these genealogies here and elsewhere, it is not necessary. Every generation is not always listed. So, for instance, Jesus is called the son of David or the son of Abraham, and obviously he's a lot of descendants in between. Kings are often a new king will often be called the son of some former king, not necessarily his father, because maybe his great grandfather was a really famous king, and so he would call himself the son of that great king or something like that. But anyway, it's very common for generations to be skipped. I am not saying that is the explanation for the length of years lived here. To me, I'm not really, I'm just not reading that in a way that I don't have a good explanation for that. And by that, I do not mean, I'm sitting here trying to figure it out and it just doesn't make sense. That's not what I mean by I do not have a good explanation. I mean, it is just not something that... Okay, so what I'm reading here, when I see this, we will read very soon, in fact, very soon, I think in the next chapter, at the beginning of the next chapter, chapter 6, that people start living much shorter lives. I think what's happening here is we are in the phase where we have just left the Garden of Eden, and in other words, what we talked about last time, we have just... Our access to God's presence, to the tree of life, to eternal life, has just been severed. And as mankind, what we're going to be reading about is this continual getting further and further away from God, as we read about with Lamech and at the end of chapter 4, and the descendants of Cain. Mankind is going further and further away from the Garden of Eden, you might say, in a metaphorical sense. You could also, if you were to think of things literally, you could say in a literal sense too, as he spreads around the world. But that's not what I think of as the Garden of Eden is, in terms of meaning, is presence, is access to the presence of God. And so, as mankind gets further and further away from God, we are going to see that. What does that mean? It means further away from the tree of life, further and further away from eternal life, further and further away from life. God is life. Later, Jesus will say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. God is life. He is not death. He is the opposite of death. God is life. And so as mankind gets further and further away from God, he gets further and further away from life. And so what's being communicated here to me is that we are still very close. You can see it's this distancing of mankind from life and therefore the decrease in life. That is what this seems to me to obviously be. And so that's the way I would read these long years. Now you can come up with sorts of things to try to explain it, but I don't understand a reason to, I just don't need it explained. I get the point that it's conveying, and it's the message that is important to me, not necessarily, as I said, being able to recreate a video evidence or something like that. Okay, so Adam lived 930 years and he died. He had a son, Seth. And so now I will just read through this, I think, without stopping for a few paragraphs here. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. I am going to stop in a minute because this just reminded me of something. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years. and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. Kenan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Jared 830 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. This will be the last paragraph I read before stopping. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Jared lived after he fathered Enoch 800 years, and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. Okay, two things we'll point out here. One will be the reason I stopped here with Enoch, because that will enhance or add to what I am trying to communicate here about reading these for meaning and not for literalness, something like that. But the other thing I wanted to point out is why I am reading each of these here, and I will not, as I said at the beginning of this video, I will not necessarily do that every time, but I did want to do it this first time because I hope you do it every time, at least 99% of the time, and I would say every time, because this type of thing, this repeated, I can't think of the word, but when you repeat this formula, you just kind of change the names and the numbers, but you're saying the same thing over and over and over with different names and different ages and so on, but just saying the same thing. There are a number of places where that occurs in the Bible, and it can seem boring, I suppose, or tedious, and I suppose in some way it is, but that doesn't mean it is not important. And that is for multiple reasons. One thing to think of here, one of the reasons is, what is the Bible? It is not just a list of facts. It is not, I do not know if I can communicate what I mean by this, but it is an important book. And by listing what the Bible is going to do from beginning to end is connect the very first word with the very last word. And there are breaks here and there, as I talked about in the Bible outline video. There are curtain rise, and then it will be hundreds of years later, curtain close, and then hundreds of years later, curtain rise, and so on. So there are those sort of gaps, but through these genealogies, the Bible is connected from word one to from the first word to the last word. And these types of things, these genealogies in particular, as an example of what I'm saying, are fundamental to, I would say, I do not know how to describe this exactly, except I just know it's real, it's true. They are very important in creating the proper, something like reverence toward the Bible, or toward what it is. It's not just a bunch of sporadic facts and important facts. I don't mean unimportant, but in other words, you could cut the Bible down a lot if you just wanted to present a certain type of message, or there are a lot of things in the Bible that many, I don't know how to say this, but I guess you get what I mean, that many people would say, well, that doesn't really need to be in there. It's not communicating like these. Does it really matter that we know these names, we know these years, and do they need to keep saying and had other sons and daughters? There are a lot of things you could cut out of the Bible. And in fact, you can find essentially, I'm not sure what is called nowadays, but when I was young, it would be called Cliff Notes. You can read a book in the Cliff Notes. So you can read Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet or something, the Cliff Notes, and you pretty much get the story. But it's not Hamlet, and there's nothing like. And when you read the Cliff Notes, it's nothing like reading Hamlet in so far as, like, you have not read Hamlet. You are not familiar with Hamlet. reading it involves all of the details that don't contribute to the Cliff Notes version of the story or something like that. In other words, the Bible is thorough and it is complete, and there is this sense of connection from beginning to end. And I fully believe that this type of thing and reading this plays an important role in that. If you skip these things, it's like you're reading the Cliff Notes. And with the Bible, I think I would have to say the Cliff Notes version would be better than not reading it, but it's nowhere near as good as reading it. And I cannot explain exactly what these do, other than what I'm attempting to do now, but there is, it is a different, the Bible is a different book than if it took all of this type of stuff out and all the repetition and everything out. That is just an important part of what it is, and the sort of what sets it aside as not a book that you reference for the proper rule. It's not like a little rule, but like a short handbook. It's not like a handbook. That's what it is, or that's part of what I'm saying. It's not a handbook that you flip to. You have a certain problem and you flip to this page and, oh, that's how I deal with this. Okay, it's not a handbook. It is insane. It accomplishes that, but it's far, far beyond that. It's a book that you live through or live in or something like that. It's a book that describes God and his creation and us as part of the creation and so on. Anyway, it's just, I'm just trying to emphasize, I don't know that I can get across exactly, or I'm pretty sure I cannot get across exactly the importance of reading these types of things. And there's one place this is fairly short. There is one place in Chronicles that is really long. And that is one place that I would kind of forgive. And for the moment, now I think you should read it, though. When I read it, I admit that I go through it quickly. I do not tarry, because it is truly just begat. But in any case, I'm reading it this first time just because I did want to make this point, but it is important, and for a gravity, like the gravity of the book or something like that. I don't know, I cannot explain it exactly, but it does something, and it is an important part of the book because it's not just a book. In other words, it's not an action adventure movie that's been cut down to, like think of an epic movie. Say a movie's been made from a book. And this book is long. It's a big book. It's an epic book, a great book, maybe from history, and it's filled with all kinds of details that would not be in the Cliff Notes version. And then you make a movie, and we got to cut this movie down to an hour and a half, so it's action packed and exciting. That movie, the hour and a half version of the action packed story, is not the book at all. It's a representation, it's a view into the book or the epic story, the full story, but it's not the full story. And that's what it would be like. And that's what the Bible would be like if it cut out all of these parts. And the thing is, if you read other ancient literature, especially once you get used to reading it, you really do kind of develop an appreciation for this type of stuff. And in particular, I think at least I developed a real appreciation for repetition. It's almost fun. It's like the chorus of a song, and you kind of get used to it or something. There are places where you read identical paragraphs and so on, especially in ancient literature, as I said, because it was memorized, and that made it easier to memorize things back then. But in any case, okay, so I've gone on long enough. The other reason this is sort of more obvious reason that this is important is because it was important to the people it was written to. It was written to the Hebrews, and this was their history. And you could trace your lineage back to Adam through this, and that means something to people. For us, because we are so far removed and we do not trace our lineage to the Hebrew people anymore, well, not anymore, but as non-Hebrews, we do not at all. But because we do not have that connection. But even today, if you were Hebrew and if you were Jewish and could trace your, this would be obviously valuable to you. Even if you're reading it in the way that I read it, this is the heritage of you, and that's who. And this was written to. This is the revelation of God to the Jews, to the Hebrews, and so it is obviously important in that sense. It allows them to trace their heritage, their lineage, back to creation. So, in that sense, it's obviously there's an obvious reason it would have been written in the Hebrew Bible. But I am saying that even for us, even though we don't have quite that element of it, we can still partake in that a little bit. And anyway, I do think it is important. Okay, so I think there was one more thing I was going to say, but I got carried away there a little bit. So, okay, so we read 18. Jared had a son, Enoch. Okay, so verse 21. Let me scroll this up a little bit. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Okay, I'm going to stop here because that breaks the form. The Enoch paragraph or verses here break the formula. It does not say he died. All the days of Enoch were whatever, and he died. It does not say that like it does with all the other or with the others. It says all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That's all it says. And so what does that mean exactly? Well, the sort of traditional, there are many traditions that grow up around Enoch. There are apocryphal texts that are written in Enoch's name and about Enoch and so on. But the idea traditionally is that Enoch was taken alive by God into heaven to be with God, and he walked with God, and then God took him. So at some point we will see two other. I'm trying to think if there are other. There's Jesus, but that is more fully explained. But there are two other sort of mysterious deaths, or something like that, or endings. There are two other men in the Bible who sort of have mysteriousness about their life like this, the end of their life like this, the end of their life on earth. One is Elijah, who the Bible does describe, we will see later, in that he is taken up into heaven. So probably, presumably something along these lines. But Elijah, while he is still living, will be taken up into heaven, so he never dies. And then Moses does die on a mountaintop, but God buries him, and so it's sort of mysterious. Moses goes onto a mountaintop, speaks with God. A few things happen that we will get to, and then he dies on the mountain, and God buries him. And there are sort of traditional, legendary. I kind of don't want to use that word but there are traditional texts talking about all of that, and even in the Bible there is I think in Jude there is a reference to the situation where Moses dies. So anyway, three sort of mysterious, I don't know what to call it. It's not necessarily death, but end of life, and Enoch is one of those. Anyway, so there is a lot of tradition and commentary on this about Enoch, where sort of legends grow up around this idea. Non-biblical legends grow up in history. So you will likely see, depending upon how much biblical sort of history you get into and everything, Enoch will come up in various contexts, and this is kind of the reason. The end of his life is very mysterious. It says, and he was not. So. Okay, when Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech. Methuselah lived after he fathered Lamech 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. One other thing to mention, by the way, if you look at these names and go back and look at the names from, I'm going to scroll up here and look at the generations of Cain that we did. It's somewhere in here. Here we have starting in verse 17, Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, built a city. These are different people, but names are very similar. I think the Bible has that a lot, and it forms these parallels and connections like we will be talking about between the New and the Old Testament. So there are a lot of that. So parallels and connections, but sort of like, the line of Cain and the line of Seth, and there's similarities, but different, and so on. So there are a lot of similar names here. We have Enoch and Mehujael, Methuselah. I think there's another one that's maybe even more similar. Oh, there it is, Methuselah, and then Lamech. And anyway, you will see a lot of that. But in this case, they are different people. This was from the line of Cain. The other is from the line of Seth. But we're getting sort of perhaps in meaning, we're perhaps getting some sort of as I said, you have these two paths open to you, the line of Cain and the line of Seth, and you have both paths open to you. And so you can be, I hate to say it this way, I never thought of it this way, but you can be good Lamech or bad Lamech kind of thing. I mean, I'm maybe starting to push things a little bit. But anyway, I was just pointing out, there is the parallelism. Do not get confused by what might seem to be a lot of extra parallelism. A lot of stories nowadays would not be told in similar ways. One, because it might be confusing, but also because I just don't think stories are as great or told as well nowadays for the most part. Well, and to be honest, most old stories were not either, but stories that have hung around for thousands of years were the good ones. So that's probably the better explanation for that. But anyway, you will see a lot of parallelism. Okay, so go now. Where did I scroll away from? Okay, so we are almost done here. Thus, all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son, and called his name Noah, saying, Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work, and from the painful toil of our hands. Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So this is obviously going to start leading into Noah. That's the end of that. I was going to say one thing. Oh, the line, again, broke the formula a little bit. Out of the ground. So he called his name Noah, saying, Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. Not exactly sure what that means. A lot of things, especially a lot of things throughout the Bible, are hard to interpret. Hard to figure out exactly what is going on here. You will know from the story of Noah that the world is flooded, and sort of it is told as essentially a sort of a new creation, and out of the ground that the Lord has cursed. Well, you can think of a new creation being this one shall bring us relief from our work. Remember the curse when Adam was cursed in the beginning after he disobeyed God. He was cursed to work the ground, and it would produce thorns and thistles, and he would have to essentially fight and sweat to live. And so that's what Lamech is referencing here, this curse that has come into the world through Adam and Eve, through their disobedience, through their exiting the Garden of Eden. Because Lamech no longer lives in the Garden of Eden, does not live in the Garden of Eden, he has to deal with this cursed ground. Well, what God is going to do, as we will see with the flood, is attempt to restore this situation with a new creation. And so my assumption is that that is what is being referenced here. Noah is going to be in some way, or in very many ways, a new Adam. When we get to that part, Noah will be told something similar to. In other words, it's a repeat. It's an attempt to fix things, and Noah will be told to essentially, restart the world and do it properly. But Noah, as you know, will fail. But in any case, that I assume that is what this is referencing. Noah will be relief from this cursed ground, and that is the promise of Noah. It turns out that Noah fails, but that is the point of the Noah story, an attempt at restarting properly. Okay, I think I will go ahead and read. Let's see, we've only been 40 minutes, so this is going to be a short one, but I think I will read these first two paragraphs of chapter 6 because they tie in with, well, obviously they tie in, they follow this part, and as you can see, the heading there at the bottom of the screen, Noah and the flood, starts in chapter 6, but after these two paragraphs. They are important to why the flood happens, but they aren't sort of Noah and the flood proper. Okay, increasing corruption on earth. And this is the entire point. So this is what leads to the flood. Things just keep getting worse. And this is what I meant about, in fact, we will read this right now. So I'll go ahead and read it, about life getting shorter and shorter. Chapter 6, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took them as their wives, any they chose. Okay, so let me reference that. That is another one of these there are a few of them in here, which is why I wanted to go ahead and deal with this all at once, along with what we just talked about with the long lives and some of the stuff that I said about literal interpretations. It is hard to know exactly what that means. The sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took them as their wives, any they chose, and they took as their wives any they chose. Daughters of man presumably means the obvious, the line of Seth, let's say. Anyway, as mankind started to spread around in the earth, they had sons and daughters, and so daughters. Well, what are the sons of God, though? Well, there are several interpretations. But I think, one obvious one is angels. Angels are often referred to as sons of God, especially in extra biblical literature, but also extra meaning outside the Bible, but also within the Bible. So sons of God could be something like angels. Kings can be referred to as the sons of God, or a king would be called the son of God. He is God's a king is sort of God's political representative on earth, and so a king is the son of God. In fact, many pagan kings would actually, or non-Hebrew kings would actually literally potentially think of themselves as the son of a god. Of course, in ancient stories, the gods and humans mixed, and their offspring were demigods, Hercules, for instance, is part god, part man, and so anyway, sons of God. We don't know. What I get, the way or another common interpretation is, as we will see, there's another word. They could be giants. In other words, you could call someone, so much like you might call a king the son of God, you might call a great warrior the son of God, right? People would attribute some sort of reason that this particular person stands so far above everyone else. So they might create this reputation of being sons of God. And as I said, in mythology, that's a word I was trying to think of earlier, a sort of mythological analysis. In mythology, some characters or individuals in mythological tales are, and I do not use that word to mean fake. I do not mean fiction. I don't mean that at all by mythology. I just mean these stories that are communicating meaning and purpose, and they have something in them. Mythology is not a bad word in this context. If I call something mythological, I don't mean what you would what most people would probably think if they just heard that word out of the blue. I mean, something like this, where you're referencing these times before time, these way back in history, what you might think of as a golden age of great men and warriors and giants and so on. And in fact, giants will be referenced a few times in the Bible, and I'll talk about that here again in just a moment. I'll talk about giants briefly here in a moment because of another word that we are about to see. And so, what does it mean? The point is, what does it mean? I do not know. It's definitely a common interpretation to think of it as the sons of God as being angels, in particular, probably fallen angels, as the mythology would later develop, this notion of fallen angels and so on, which is not talked about here in the Bible, but here anyway, there may be some allusions in a couple of places, but anyway, fallen angels found the daughters of men attractive and mated with them, and so on. And then that is an obvious explanation for what we are about to read. Not the next line. Do that first, and then we'll kind of reconnect a little bit of this, and that'll be about it. The next line is, Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. Okay, so this is what I was referencing earlier when I was talking about the long. I think part of the point of those long lifespans, and then, or of the long lifespan and now a shortened lifespan of 120 years, is to demonstrate exactly what the whole point of these last couple of chapters leading up to the flood is. It's this degradation, this slow, fast decline from the Garden of Eden. Once Adam and Eve transgress and begin to reproduce, things just really keep getting worse and worse and worse. And I think that the length of life issue is one way of symbolically representing that, an effective way of representing that, because life is ebbing away as you get further away from God. Life is just departing, being separated from God, being separated from life, being separated from Eden, from the tree of life, from the garden, from God, etc. Okay, so that's sort of a statement like we've reached a point here, a critical point, that when it says his days shall be 120 years and my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, that's a clear, I mean, we're getting set up for the Noah story. Man has not turned back to God. There is a real separation from God that is being emphatically pronounced here. And so that's going to be what needs to be solved, and spend the entire rest of the Bible solving it. Okay, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, or Nephilim. I say im a lot of times when I see im at the end. I think it probably more like im, but anyway, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Okay, so this is what I was referencing, sort of like you can think of something like how the Greeks had the age of Hercules and all the other heroes, in the Iliad, and Hercules was not in the Iliad, but the days of Odysseus and so on. Anyway, the Iliad type days, the sort of golden age, the age of, there is a name for this, but anyway, the golden age of great warriors and great villains and great heroes, demigods, and so on. The Bible, this paragraph in particular here seems to be referencing, at least in theory, something like that feel. This age before history, when, I mean, you can imagine in the story, you're spreading out, and this is an age of exploration, you can think of it as. I mean, you're spreading out, as in the story, you're leaving the Garden of Eden, and everything available on the earth is as of yet untouched. And so this age of exploration, as in a period in our Western history, so not too many hundred years ago, these sort of ages of exploration encourage or something like that, or bring out great explorers or great warriors, etc., and they develop and they become legends and so on. So anyway, however you want to interpret it, but it appears to be referencing some period like this of because then there at the end it does say the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. So the Nephilim were on the earth then and later when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. So back to the sons of God. That definitely makes it feel, I mean, if you're going with what it feels like, and that's what I tend to just allow myself to process it in that way. It feels something like the sons of God would be something like angels or some sort of power that's greater than man, or at least something like the great men of, I mean, because it's all referenced together. That's what it says here. If you think of it in terms of angels, sort of angels mating with the daughters of men, fallen angels, something like that, mating with the daughters of men, and then these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. Okay, so that would be exactly like Achilles or Hercules, or whatever. That would be the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That would exactly be something like that. At least it's giving that, but my point in pointing that out is not to mean it literally. It is to convey the idea that this time, once again, essentially repeating what I've been saying for the whole time about chapters 1 to 11. This is part of the story told to communicate something. And it's not a videotape of history. It is telling deep, sort of metaphysical or philosophical, telling us insights about the structure of reality and how, not how in a literal sense the world that we know came about, but how in a meaning sense the world came about. Mankind separates himself from God and that is essentially the problem in our lives. And so the Bible then teaches us how to find our way back to God. And so anyway, you'll get your own feel for how to, like, if you try to read this, well, what does it really mean? You will find commentators who say this, commentators who say that. You just have to develop, I think, a consistent, I would say, as I keep saying, try to get a feel for the meaning and not get caught up in something like the literalness of it. Okay, I'm going to try to get past this. Once we get out of Genesis 11, I will stop, or to Genesis 11, I will stop with this literal stuff. But I'm trying to emphasize that because don't get bogged down with something like that. Don't do that. What is this telling you about? What is this telling you about the world and setting up so that we can then solve it? Everything, almost all of this type of stuff will not occur. There will be a few difficult, challenging things like this to understand later in the Bible, but not much. The vast majority of it is here in chapters 1 to 11. That's hard to understand in this way. Okay, and one more thing. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. There's one other place, I think just one other place, that the Nephilim are mentioned in the Bible, and that is in Numbers, I think, later when the Israelites are in the wilderness and they are supposed to go in and take the land of Canaan, but they send out some people to see what the land is like before they try to go in and fight. And the spies that they send out to check on the land, Canaan, come back and say, most of them come back and say that the land is full of giants and it's these Nephilim. And around that same time period, in that same geographical region, other giants are mentioned that the Hebrews do conquer, although later they go in there too. But anyway, so the idea of giants. So that just kind of ties in with this. I think Nephilim actually means something like fallen ones. Of course, it's not saying that the Nephilim are the sons of God, but it's also not quite clear. So anyway, we just have all these ideas in here that very much, to me, put me in the sense of it's this crossover period, just like the Greeks had. That's how you can relate to it. When you go from the Iliad to then when you have the great heroes of old, exactly like this says, the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. That's exactly, to me, that reminds me exactly of the Greek situation with you have Achilles and Odysseus and all of them, and then some hundreds, and the Greeks in Aristotle's day and a little before are reading the Iliad, which wasn't too long before them that it took place in their minds or in their stories and so on, but life isn't like that anymore. And so that's what I'm seeing here. When Abraham comes about in 6 more chapters or so, it's not going to be like this anymore. But several hundred years before Abraham, or 1,000 years, whatever, it doesn't have a time frame. But there was this time, and that was the exactly this, the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So it's this golden age of history that's being referenced here. And it's in that golden age, stories are being told about it. Important, particular stories are being told about it, which is what we're reading. Just like in the Iliad, to kind of communicate deep truths about your culture and about history, but not necessarily videotape literal truth. Okay, just about done. The Lord saw that the wickedness. Oh, did I finish with that? These were the mighty. Yeah. The Nephilim were on the earth. Yeah, okay. Verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Okay, and so obviously that will lead us right into the Noah story that will begin in the next video. But this is also telling us something about God and certainly about the way that the Bible will be written. And in time, I will talk about, although I may have already done this somewhat in one of the Bible outline video, I will talk about how I think the Bible is descriptive. It is describing the world and God and us in a way that we can understand and relate to. And I think this is a good example of that. And God is definitely personal in the Bible, and appropriately so. I mean that is that we understand, we can have relationships with people. So anyway, this is a clear demonstration that it's setting up that throughout the Bible, God will have these very human emotions. Now, as I said, I think the Bible is talking to us in a way that we can understand. It's going to be an interesting thing as you read in the Bible and study and learn more. And there is this dichotomy, or this way that you learn to think and holding two thoughts in your mind at the same time that do not seem like they can go together, or do not seem like they go together, certainly not naturally go together, but there's a certain beauty and complexity and perfectness to being able to do that, because that's what real people are like. That's what real life is actually like. It's not mathematical, and well, if this is true, then this cannot be true. Like, that's not how humans are. You can be like this and like that, sort of the opposite. You can have two thoughts in your mind. You can want to do this, but also want to do the opposite, or not want to do it. You can want something and not want it at the same time for different reasons. Humans are complex, and the Bible is presented that way, and God is also presented that way, where God is unchanging and all sorts of things. And then at other times, God will be presented like this, and it grieved him to his heart. When you're speaking about certain aspects of God, something like that. God, something like that is not the way you would be talking. God would be more unchanging and anyway, there will be times in for instance, there will be times in the Bible when it talks as though almost like this, like God is surprised, like he regrets it, but then at other times it will be very clear that God knew what was going to happen before it happened. So you can still regret it, I suppose, but it's a challenge to understand, well, that doesn't quite, like, if God already knew it was going to happen, then why would it be surprising or something like that? Now, this doesn't say surprising, it says regret. But anyway, there will be those challenges, but there are multiple ways to get around those. One, the main one that I would say is that it is describing God in a personal way, in a way that is very human-like, because that's the only way we can understand it. If it described what God was truly experiencing, let's say, we would not understand it. It would be like speaking a foreign language. The Bible has to talk to us in a way that we can understand and make use of. And so I would see it that way, but when I say, so I would see it that way, as though in the end, I would say it's not that God was grieving in the sense that we would do such a thing. But then again, I would say, but you have to think of it that way, and you have to hear it that way, and think of God in that way, because if you don't, then you're missing the point of something, right? It was written in that way so we could understand. In other words, it might not quite be literally exactly what God is. In other words, God is not human, so he's not experiencing regret and so on in the way that a human would. He's not going to later experience anger and so on in the way that a human would. You can't quite think of it like that, but you cannot not think of it like that either, because that's the way it was written, and it was written like that for a reason. But what will happen as you mature in your understanding is you will be able to hold both things in your mind at once, or at least be able to, essentially hold them both in your mind at once. You will be able to hold them in tension with one another, and understand that this means truly that God was grieved, God regretted, God wanted to, what does it say at the end? For I am sorry that I have made them. In other words, God regretted it, like he wishes he hadn't done it. But at the same time, God is completely in control at all times. He is the king of the universe, and on and on and on. So you will be. It has to do with later a good example of this will be later when in Christianity, when thinking about the Trinity, and how God is one but three. God is one nature but three persons. So God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit are three people, three persons. But one God. What does that mean? Well, you cannot reconcile these ideas in your mind. Not exactly, but you can feel certain analogies, and you can say something about Jesus. He is the Son, and God is the Father, while also saying they are both God and both, so they are. Anyway, you will get to the point where you are comfortable saying two things that you cannot reconcile directly, but both are true, right? So, yeah, that's maybe what I'm saying here. You will have to get to that point, and you will have to get to that point not because the Bible is this one book that you have to treat that way, and all the rest of life you can reconcile everything and everything makes sense, but this book, if you want to understand it, you got to learn to believe things that don't make sense. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that reality, understanding reality, is actually more like this than it is like everything fits together in a way that's understandable. And if it doesn't fit together, you just don't understand it enough yet. I'm saying that's actually very wrong. And there are reasons for that, I would say that, and there are degrees to which it's wrong. It depends on what level of reality you're talking about and so on. But anyway, this part about God regretting creating man is I think a first really good introduction to this idea of you will need to get to the point, and it's a beautiful thing. Once you can do that, once you're able to do that, you can really start understanding a lot more, certainly about the Bible, but also about people, about yourself, about everything, where you can get to the point where in your mind you can say, this is true and this is true. They do not appear to make sense to me on the surface. Like it seems at first, it seems that this can't be true if this is true. You know, they can't both be true. It seems that way on the surface. They cannot both be true. And yet, when I think about each individual one, I know each of them has to be true. What I don't quite get in my head is how both are true. But the thing is, as you begin to develop a more mature understanding of the nature of our nature, the nature of reality, and in particular of the nature of being, of life, you will begin to realize, oh, but wait a minute, it is true. You know, this is true and this is true. They cannot both be true, but they are both true, or something like that. Because the they cannot both be true is actually wrong. It's applying a mathematical type logic to a very non-mathematical being, a person, or God, who is a person. So God is not a human, but God is a person. Those words mean different things. So when I say God is a person, I don't mean God is human. I mean God is a person. That means something different, which we'll get to later perhaps, but hopefully that just makes some sense. God in the Hebrew Bible, and certainly in Christianity it gets very explicit, is a person, but in the Hebrew Bible, clearly, God is certainly is personified. So God is certainly somebody. He is not a far-off God that you don't really have any contact with. God is very personal in the Bible. He experiences emotions. He talks. He does things. He is here and he's there and he's everywhere. And anyway, God is very personal in the Bible. Okay, but anyway, what I was saying last, and then I think we're done, is just have that rolling around in your mind, and you will develop this ability, if you do not have it already, to hold these two things in tension and realize, actually, that is the way persons that is the way they work. The more scientific, quote unquote, scientific or mathematical part, where if A then not A, A and not A cannot both be true, that doesn't exactly apply to persons. That applies to math and certain other things, especially non-life beings, perhaps, but not exactly to people. And anyway, so yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. There's some more you can say about that and make clarifications and so on, but okay. So you will need to think of God. You will need to develop this ability to think of God in these very personified ways, because that's the only way to understand what it's saying. But also knowing there's a different level of analysis where you know that what it's doing is personifying God in a way that we can relate to, but God isn't exactly, but it doesn't mean God is experiencing it as though he's human. But that's the best way to understand it. But at the same time, you have to understand that it's God, and whatever it is that you can't quite get because God isn't human, you know he is doing properly because he's God, or something like that. So in other words, when God experiences anger, he's not mad in the same way that we are. So you can't quite attribute it, so it's not like a human is mad, but anger is the way we experience it. That's one thing. There will be some situations here where we where I talk about how I would say the Bible is descriptive and phenomenological. I think I mentioned that word. What we'll mean by that is it's not quite true that God is experiencing anger, his anger as anger in the way that we would, but it is true that we can say we are experiencing God's anger as though he were angry at us, something like that. But he's going to be angry at us properly. So you have to keep all these things in mind. We feel it as anger, even if it's not truly anger on his part. So it's called anger because that's how we're experiencing it. Anyway, so you'll get to that. Okay, one last thing. It's like a child being disciplined by a parent. And the parent knows what they're doing. They're disciplining properly. It's for the child's own good. But the child doesn't know that. Yeah, I should have said it this way. If you get this is a big part of what I mean. It's not all there. There's more to it, but this is a good first step to understanding what I'm talking about. If a parent properly disciplines a child for their own good, it's to train the child or to protect the child. The child may very well experience that discipline as anger of the parent or meanness, or they're just being mean or something. They're not being mean at all. That is truly the correct that description of how the child is experiencing it. In the child's mind and world and so on, the child may very well fully experience it as the anger, the wrath of the parent, right? Discipline. But from the parent's point of view, that's not what's going on. What is actually happening is an act of love. The child may experience it as an act of wrath or anger, but at the same, and that's true, that is how the child is experiencing it. But at the exact same time, from another perspective, it is an event of pure love. If the parent did not care about the child, then it wouldn't even bother disciplining them, perhaps, because who cares? But it's very specifically because the parent loves the child that this event is taking place, and so, but it's experienced completely differently depending upon the perspective, the parent or the child. And so both are true. And so what I'm saying here is that what I mean by both are true is some people would want to say, well, no, it's not really true that the child, that, it's not really anger, it really is love. Well, I would say, no, you can't think of it that way. In other words, many people would say, well, no, the child is just wrong. It's not anger. And I mean, okay, I know what that means. But if you keep doing that to yourself, if you keep doing that to your mind, and you just, in other words, if you're never able to put yourself completely in the child's perspective, and you only think, oh, well, the child's wrong, like, you won't understand what's going on, because in the Bible, you are the child. And if you can't, if all you can do is say that, so in other words, I'm saying that much of the Bible is essentially written from the child's perspective, because we are the children and we have to be able to understand it. So it has to speak to us in a language that we understand. So if the way you think of the child's perspective is that it's wrong, and so essentially you're going to have to say that everything you read in the Bible, not everything, but I mean lots of things, are wrong. Oh, that's not what it really means. And you're just going to be it's just going to be a pure fight, and you'll come up with you'll have to dance around to make things make sense and so on. The much better way, the much wiser way, is to learn to think in this way, to learn to think as both the child and the parent at the same time. Now, because we are the child in so many of these situations, of course, as you develop wisdom, you grow closer and closer to God. And so you develop that higher and higher understanding, right? So you can be a little child, or you can be a closer to God child, But what you need to do in the Bible, when you're reading the Bible, is something like know that you are the child, but also know that what you're seeing isn't quite the way God sees it, and God is right. So And so anyway, you'll just develop this skill and ability to hold both of those perspectives, both of those truths in mind at the same time, because we will experience God's wrath, and we will feel it as though God is angry and throwing a lightning bolt at us. We will go through points in our life like that, and we have to feel it like that, because that's the best way to communicate it. Okay, I'm to understand that something is happening because something is wrong in the world, and God is angry. But then we have to also have the wisdom to say, okay, I'm the child. I know God loves me. So what is really going on here? So but you have to, anyway, both sides have to grip you, and you have to be able to speak and think in both at the same time to develop wisdom. And that gets you eventually to move through the path. We'll talk about this at some point, to move along the path from being child to becoming like God. That is the entire purpose of the Bible, to move toward God, to walk to God. And it's what I talked about back in Genesis 2, with Adam and Eve being sort of portrayed as little children. Well, they are in the portrayal here, but you can kind of grow up and you can become wiser and wiser. And anyway, those two points of view begin to merge in a special way as you develop experience with thinking this way and understanding the Bible and so on, and understanding God. Again, when I say the Bible, understand the Bible, I kind of mean something like grow closer and closer to I don't mean a full understanding of God, but to understanding God. The Bible is a revelation from God of his own character and of reality, of our character, of our nature, of his nature, etc. That is what the Bible is. It's a revelation from God of the nature of reality and of himself and of ourselves and so on. Okay, that is chapter 5 and the first part of chapter 6 in Genesis. I think that's it. The next video we'll pick up with the flood. Good night.